You can run SQL Server on so many things other than Windows. So this course will teach you how to run SQL Server on Linux, in containers, and on Kubernetes. Or in other words, we will talk about all the ways to run SQL Server on anything but Windows. Join me on a trip that I hope will be a good mix of hands-on demos and theory to explore how running SQL servers on platforms such as Kubernetes can be both lightweight, to speed up your development processes, as well as enterprise and production ready. Let us talk about the required demo environment for a minute. What you really need for this course is a single Linux machine with 8 GB of RAM and 4 cores. My setup, however, is a bit more complex. To start with, I'm using 6 Linux servers. 1 dedicated box to run SQL Server on Linux, 1 to run SQL Server on containers, and 4 machines for my Kubernetes environment, including a dedicated NFS server for storage. All my Linux boxes have the NFS client tools installed, while the NFS server, of course, also has the NFS server activated. These machines have between 4 and 32 GB of RAM and 4 to 8 cores each. Again, this is far beyond the minimum requirements, so don't worry if you can't replicate this entire setup. I have picked Ubuntu 20.04 as my Linux distribution and version, and we will talk in more depth in the next module which Linux version you can and can't use to run SQL Server. In addition to my Linux machine, I'm also running 2 Windows boxes. One of them is my AD domain controller running Windows Server 2022, and the other one is a Windows 10 client, which I'm using as my main client. Almost all client tools are cross-platform though, so you could also run everything from a single Linux box again. I assigned 4 cores to both Windows boxes, with the client getting 16 gigs of RAM and the domain controller 4. If you're wondering why the client needs 16 gigs of RAM, because we'll actually also use it as a server in one of our modules. As their name suggests, these boxes serve a purpose. The domain controller machine is my domain controller and also running the DNS and DHCP service. In my Windows client, I started with installing Chocolate as a package manager. I then used Choco to install VS Code and the PowerShell extension, which is where we're running all my demos from. For connectivity, I also installed the OpenSSH client as well as curl and grep. Last but not least, I also added the SQL Server Client Tools Management Studio, Azure Data Studio, as well as a new SQL CMD, so we can connect to our SQL Server instances on Linux from this Windows client then. I will not get into the details of how to deploy and install Linux, NFS storage, or a domain controller. That would be very much out of scope for this course. However, I have provided you the script to deploy all the required client tools on the Windows client in case you want to start with a fresh machine for this one.